Hello, my name is Frances Kane. I am the Research Fellow on the Northern Ireland Placename Project at Queen's University Belfast, and I want to welcome you to my talk today on the hidden history of placenames. Unfortunately, the talk isn't being presented live as we had originally hoped, but we will stick with the online format for now, and I will make it up to the city to talk to you in person about placenames as soon as restrictions allow. So what's in a name? The reason that I put this slide first is to get you thinking about a place name as being a marker of a place beyond a location. So there are various different types of information that can go into a place name. They can that I'm going to talk about in the following slides. But really, I want you to start thinking about what type of information goes into a name. This image here that I've pulled off Google, I'm not going to make any suggestions as to the origin of this name, but just to get you thinking of the fact that a place name can contain a lot more information than, say, the geographical location of a particular place. So what kind of elements or what kind of things do we see described in place names, or what things are places named after? And one of a really common element that we see in place names is descriptions of natural features that may or may not still be able to be seen today. So a really interesting one in terms of the city that we should have been speaking from today is the Bogside. You'll all know the Bogside as being the area that you can view from the city walls, now quite densely populated with houses. But in previous times, the River Foyle actually flowed around Derry, so Derry was essentially an island. And whenever this part of the River Foyle dried up, it became marshland, so it became like a bog or marshy land. So the Bogside is essentially the side of the city that had become a bog when the river was diverted. So we see natural features or descriptions of natural features very commonly in place names. We also see a lot of man-made features making their way into place names. Another example that is from the council area is Plum Bridge. So Plum Bridge refers to a bridge that crosses the Glenelly River in the village. There are different origins or different explanations as to the origin of the word plum. It may be a Scots word that means a pool of water. But I wanted to use this example to show you that just in the same way that natural features of the landscape can make their way into place names, man-made features can also make their way into place names. People also feature quite heavily in place names. Sometimes the identity of the person can be quite clear, whereas in older names that the identity of the person might not be as clear, or it may refer to, example, for a type of tradesman or someone's occupation. So it's not as easier to pin down who the people are, but people do feature very heavily in place names. The example that I've used from this area is Newtownstewart. So another English name. Newtownstewart was founded as a village on the estate of Sir Robert Newcomen, who was granted the land during the time of the plantation. So Newtownstewart, or the surname Stewart, is actually named from Sir William Stewart from Scotland, who was granted extensive lands in the 17th century. So the Newtownstewart is in County Tyrone, but the Stewarts are also heavily associated with County Donegal, and you'll see some places named after them in County Donegal as well. So people also make their way into place names, which is in a way that commemorates them as being significant figures in various areas. So I've already mentioned natural features, but more general descriptions of the landscape can also make their way into place names. So the waterside in this city is a really clear example of a description of the landscape. So the waterside is named from its position on the east bank of the River Foyle. So those kind of four elements, they're not exhaustive, but they start to give you an idea of the type of things that make their way into our place names, the types of elements that are important. So, thinking again about the title of the talk, The Hidden History of Our Place Names. Well, thinking about the last 4 examples, they're not really, we wouldn't really call them hidden. They're quite clear as to what they refer to. But moving on to other names in the vicinity, names like Dunamana or Degarvan, Foyle, Strabane, Lisnagelvin, all these types of names. Unlike the names that we have just looked at, the meaning of these place names are not immediately obvious. So we can't tell straight away, for example, if a name like Sperrin refers to a natural feature, a man-made feature, a person, a group of people, or perhaps something in the landscape, or maybe something different. So starting to think about these types of names that aren't immediately obvious kind of takes us in the direction of the hidden history of place names. So why are these names not obvious as to what they refer to? Well, the reason is that Ireland was almost totally Irish speaking until the 17th century. So the vast majority of the place names in Ireland have their origins in the Irish language, unlike the first 4 that we saw there that were English language names. So if you look at this picture, it's an example of a road sign in the south that has the Irish language forms in italics and then the English language forms below them in capital letters. So we see that while the names refer to the same place, they don't quite look the same in Irish as they do in English. And why is that? Why do they look so different? What happened to the Irish names? What happened to the names of the place in the 17th century, and also a little bit before that in the 12th century? We had a little bit of English influence, but really the 17th century was a time of great shift. So whenever the names were coined in the Irish language, what happened to them when they were brought into the English language, or when English became the main language of Ireland? Well, essentially 3 things happened. Some places were renamed. Some of the Irish language place names were translated. But by far the most common process by which the Irish language names made their way into the English language and the forms that they are today is that they were Anglicised. This slide just gives us one example of a place name that has been renamed. So Hillsborough, just outside Belfast, is named from a Sir Moses Hill, and we see that in this 1744 form here, Hillsborough from Sir Moses Hill. But if we look back, so this is a chronological list of recordings of the place name of Hillsborough. If we look back, we see this other form appearing for Hillsborough, which is Crumlin. And actually we see this back as far as 1595. So in the 16th century, what we now know as Hillsborough was previously known as Crumlin, and Crumlin being an Irish language form. We're going to talk a little bit about Irish language forms before, but this name is a clear example of where the Irish name Crumlin has just been changed to Hillsborough. So I said that some of the names were also translated. An example of a translated name is Newcastle. So if we see the 1612 recording here of Newcastle, we also see Newcastle in 1609. But if we look back to earlier records of the name in the annals, we see Castleinne or Castleinne. So this is the Irish for Newcastle. So this Irish name, Castleinne, was directly translated from Irish into English to the form that we have today. So we have renamings and we have translations. But I said previously that by far the most common way that the Irish language names were brought into the English language is that they were anglicised. So what does this mean? Well, whenever the Irish language forms were anglicised, they were written down according to the conventions of contemporary English. So we see the example here of Dundonal, which is the Irish form for Donegal. So you can see the consonants tend to be the same. So we have Dún becoming Don and Nanal becoming Gal. So they become obscured in a certain way, often to the point where they're beyond recognition. This Donegal and Dundonal is quite a straightforward one to recognise. But this process of anglicisation is also sometimes called transliteration, and this is what happened to most of the names that we see around us today. So the names from the previous slide, that like Gaeilge and Chantalo and Derry, were all anglicised names. So this is a process by which the meanings of the names have become hidden. So just to think of an analogy of how the names were changed. If you think about a name like Donegal coming from Dundonal, this is the example from the previous slide. If we imagine the name in its Irish language form being on one side of a car wash, and the transition from Irish into English is like coming through this car wash, and the different type of soaps and different things that get put on the car are the influences that the shift from one language to another plays on the name. So we have two different groups of speakers. We have the native Irish language speakers and then the English speaking settlers. We have two languages that have different words for different things, different spelling systems, different alphabets and different pronunciations. So when the name goes through this process of shift from one language to another under all these influences, it comes out looking a little bit different than what it went in before. So we have a name like Dundonal going through the different influences from one language to another and coming out as Donegal. So that's a helpful way of thinking about how the names become hidden. So if you imagine a process where you didn't know what the original name was, so we have a place name here, which is Carnagal, which is in County Antrim. If you imagine this name has come through the same processes as Donegal has come via a process of recovery, would you be able to perhaps suggest what the original name was? We know that Donegal came from Dundonal. We can sometimes predict what Carnagal comes from. And indeed, the first element, carn, is a word for a heap of stones or a mound. The name has also made its way into the English where it's known as a cairn. But this process of recovery and digging up the hidden history and the hidden meaning behind a place name is the research that we carry out in the Northern Ireland Place Project. So we essentially take the English language forms like Carnagal and try and work backwards using different pieces of evidence to find out what the original form was. So Carnanal was the cairn or the stone mound of the foreigners, with the same meaning for the second element, gal being the word for a foreigner, that we also see in Dundonal. So this is the hidden part being dug up. And when I talk about dug up, that's essentially what we do in the Northern Ireland Placing Project. It's a process of recovery. So if you imagine an archaeologist dusting down the bones to see what's underneath, this is what we do in a linguistic sense. So we dust down the contemporary anglicised names to try and find out what the original Irish language forms of these names were. And then using the Irish language form, we can then assign a suggested meaning to each of the place names. So that is the aim of the Northern Ireland Placing Project. We have a corpus of over 30,000 names of settlements and physical features and over 130,000 historical references to these names. So not only do we look at the names as they appear today, we have older forms of the name that can sometimes tell us a bit more about the origin of the name compared with the contemporary forms. So some of our sources or some of our names to go back as far as Ptolemy's geography, so the first map of Ireland that we have in 150 AD to the first Ordnance Survey that was conducted in the Ireland in the early 19th century. Our database is searchable. If you go to www.placenames.org, you can put in your place name and see what we have suggested as to its origin, and you can also see these historical forms. So the way that your place name would have been spelt in previous times. So when we're looking at anglicised forms or the current forms of place names, we can sometimes predict where they have come from because we do see some patterns. Now it's not uniform, it's not entirely certain all the time that one component has come from another, but we can use that as a first step. And you may recognise some of these components on the left hand side as being parts of place names that you may be familiar with. So things like bally place names. Bally usually comes from bhaile, which is a word for a place that has extended into different meanings, but bally can also come from bell aha, which is the forward mouth. Kill, the component kill, can sometimes refer to a church or a graveyard or to a wood. We have drum names that usually signify drim, the word for a ridge or a hill. Clon usually refers to clun, meadow. Knock is the word for a hill, and so on and so forth. So these are components that you may recognise from local place names, and some of the typical elements that they might derive from. But as always, you have to treat generalisations with some caution. But these are a good starting point. So coming back to our place names that we saw a couple of slides ago, the place names that weren't immediately obvious, do we have the same things or the same elements appearing in these names as we saw in the English language names? So we know why these names look a bit different, why they aren't immediately obvious, because these are names of Irish language origin that have been brought into the English language, and they come through this process of Anglicisation, which has obscured them. So the meanings of them, essentially, when you look at them as they are today, the meaning can be hidden. So I'm going to spend some time now and go through some of these and hopefully show you that we do see the same types of elements appearing in the Irish language place names as we see in the English ones. Some natural features then in the names that we have gathered together. Foil, you should all be aware of the name foil. As with a lot of our analysis, we can only make a suggestion. And foil is one of those names that we can only make a suggestion. We can't be definitely sure as to where it came from. But it may come from the Irish word fheall, which has cognates or related words in Welsh. And this word means a lip. And the lip may be a metaphorical reference to Magilligan Point. So this photograph here is of Magilligan Point at the mouth of Lough Foyle, which looks a bit like a lip sticking out when you're viewing it from the Donegal side of the loch. So this is a potential natural feature that appears in one of the local names. Another one that we had on the list there was Slieve Kirk. Slieve is the Irish word for a hill or a mountain. So Slieve Kirke is the word, or is the name for the mountain of the hen. And indeed, if you go to a map and you look up Slieve Kirk, you should be able to see that the mountain is there. So that's the mountain of the hen. Another natural feature that we see in a local name is seen in the name of the Sperrin or the Sperrin Mountains. The element Sperrin means a little spur of rock, and in the case of the Sperrin Mountains, it refers to an area that is abounding in little spurs of rocks. So the Sperrin Mountains are the mountains that are abounding in little rock spurs. So we see some rocks there from the Sperrin Mountains. That is another natural feature that appears in names. So what about man-made features then? Do man-made features appear in the Irish language place names? Absolutely. So Cranagh in County Tyrone derives from Crannog, the Irish word for an artificial island that was usually built in lakes. People stored their property on there. They lived on the island because they were safe from being surrounded by water. But Cranagh comes from Crannog, so this is a man-made feature. The name Cranagh actually appears as Cranach na Coney, the Cranagh of the dwelling or resting in the 17th century. So while we only have the Crannog part existing in the anglicised form of today's name, by looking at the historical evidence, so if we remember the analogy of dusting off the names, if we dust off the name back until the 17th century, we see this name that has more information, and it might have connotations of watching or keeping vigil. The place name may then have a religious association, perhaps suggesting a place of prayer or a resting place for funerals. So in a way, we can dig up a bit more of the hidden history of this place name by looking at an earlier form that may be able to tell us a little bit more about the significance of the island. Another man-made feature that features quite heavily in place names and in a local one is Castle Derg. So Castle Derg derives from Castlin na Dearga, the castle of the River Derg, and the ruins of a castle in Castle Derg still sit in Castle Derg. The ruins are of a castle that was built in 1610, but this castle was actually built on the site of an earlier castle, which we tend to see a lot in these types of structures. They get built on the site of a previous structure. So the man-made feature that makes its way into Castle Derg is obviously Castlin, the word for castle. But if we look at Derg itself, this is also an anglicised name. The River Derg has its origins in the Irish word for red, which is jarg. That has been connected with the castle then that sits on the river. Another man-made feature that we see pretty commonly in place name is a fort. Now we have a number of different words for fort in Irish. So we have lis, we have dún, and we have ra. So 3 different distinct words that refer to different forts. But lis in the name, for example, Lisnagelvin, is a type of fort that is usually a ring fort. So the first element in Lisnagelvin is this word lis for a fort, although there's no trace of the ring fort in the townland anymore. So Lisnagelvin, a form in the 17th century, may suggest Lisnanalwin, the fort of the sparrows. So this has been one previous suggestion, but more recently there have been other suggestions as to the origin of Lisnagelvin. So this is one that we can't be completely sure of the meaning of the second element, but I just wanted to highlight this as being an example of lis of a fort, a man-made feature. Don't have any pictures of the fort or of the fort site, so I've just put in a picture there of Altnagelvin. Altnagelvin is a place name in the same parish as Lisnagelvin, so this is an example of how we can draw comparisons, and the Nagelvin part of Lisnagelvin and Altnagelvin may well be a reference to the same thing or person. Some other people in place names. Arty Garvin is Rt Garwin, the height of Garvin's house. This name features the personal name Garvin, which is derived from Garv, the Irish word for rough, and it's also the basis of the surname O'Garwin, which is anglicised as O'Garvin, which is generally regarded as being a Munster name, but the personal name Garvin appears close by. Another person in a place name is Diarmid, who appears in Clondermot. The personal name Diarmid is a very old name. It was one of the 20 most popular names in early Ireland. But as we're dealing with personal names here and these names that are very old, it's a lot more difficult to try and identify who the people were behind these names, but they would have had some sort of significance at the time the names were coined. So people do find their way into place names of Irish language origin, but because they tend to be older, it's sometimes less easy to identify them. One exception to that are saints that find their way into place names. We can sometimes associate a saint with an area, but Dermot and Garvin remain mysteries for now. So what other types of people make their way into place names? We mentioned earlier that sometimes people's occupation name is associated with the place. So Dunamana is the fort of the monks, Dunamneacha. And Dunamana seems to have been named by association with a monastery, and the site of which may be marked by the ruins of the parish church of Donaghadee. There are ruins of a castle in Dunamana, so if you remember I said earlier there were different words for a fort, so Dun being another word for a fort, and the Dunamana castle may have been built on the site of the original fort that has made its way into the name. So not to be outdone by the monks, we also have nuns in place names. Gaeilge, you will probably know as being an area in the city centre, but Gaeilge is located in the townland of Ballinagaeilge, the townland of the nuns. So Ballinagaeilge is shortened to Gaeilge, which is what is known today. So we know that it's townland of the nuns. There is now no trace of the nunnery, but it did form part of the broader ecclesiastical landscape of the city. as the townland itself is located in the parish of Templemore, which is from the Irish Templemore, the great church. So there was a real ecclesiastical significance to the area, and there was also obviously a nunnery there at one time, which is now gone. So what about the landscape then? Do we get the landscape in place names as we saw earlier for Bogside? Absolutely. A nice example of this is Shantallow, another district in the city. Shantallow derives from Shantallu, old land, and old in this particular use may mean long cultivated, because of the previous significance of the quality of land. A similar name is Shantavney from Shantavney, old field in County Tyrone. So this name may also have a cultivational connotation to the word shan, old. And I've just put a wee map clip here of Shantallow National School, and Steelstown, as another example of a person who's made their way into a place name. So Steelstown is obviously all one word now, but it looks here to have previously named after someone perhaps named Steele. Another landscape name in the vicinity is Killetter, or Killeater. I'm not quite sure about the pronunciation of that one. I'm showing my Belfast roots at this stage. But this townland takes its name from Kill-Aichter, the lower wood. Now if you look at the landscape of this townland today, you can see there are actually very little trees, apart from this little bit on the right hand side here. But we know that Irish woodland suffered extensive clearing at the time of the plantation, so a lot of Ireland, which is now cleared from woodland, may have previously been covered with native woodland, and sometimes the only clue that we have to that is a kill name, a woodland name. We have to exercise caution with the anglicised component kill, so K-I-L or K-I-L-L, as it very often represents the Irish word kill, the word for a church, but it can also represent kill, the word for a wood. The pronunciation difference is very subtle, and English ears might not pick it up, which is why both words have been anglicised with K-I-L or K-I-L-L. But usually whenever we have kill referring to a church or a graveyard, we can see some remains of a church, or perhaps a church that's been built on the site of an older church. But in this townland example, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be the lower wood is the origin of this name. So we've talked already about some examples of historical forms of the name, and before we even look at a map, if we look at the older forms of a name, we can also dig up some of the hidden history. And I'm gonna go with the obvious one, considering the audience that I was supposed to have anyway. I'm sure we have people tuning in from outside the district area, but the contemporary city of Derry, Londonderry. If we look back across the historical forms, the place name actually tells us a lot about the history of the city. So we know that the London component of Londonderry has been added by virtue of an association with the London companies at the time of the plantations in the 17th century. So the first example of London in Londonderry is in 1613, and that addition still appears today. But before we have Londonderry, we actually have Dara, which is the Irish language component that means oakwood, that contributes to the Derry part. And we actually see Derry names all over Ireland, so the likes of Oireachtas in County Antrim is another example. But Derry, or its component Dara, is the core element that finds its way in all the historical forms of the city. So if we look to 546 AD, we see Dara Columcille, which is Columcille's oakwood. And in the 6th century, the name emerged following the foundation of a monastery by St. Columcille in the city. So you'll, if you've spent any time in the city, you'll see St. Column and the word column. The St. Column is quite prominent, and he founded a monastery in the city, and his significance is recorded in the name Dara Columcille, so Columcille's oakwood. But before St. Columcille arrived and founded his monastery, the name of the place still contained this component dura, the oakwood. And in 535 AD we have a form dura Gaeilge, so Gaeilgeocht oakwood. So before Columcille took the name of the oakwood for himself, we have this other individual, Gaeilgeocht, who we know a lot less about, but we know that he had some significance in the area, and the oakwood that is referred to in Dura was named after him. So having a look back through the older historical forms is definitely a useful way of uncovering the hidden history of a place name, because we don't have any mention of either Gaeilgeocht or Columcille in the contemporary names of the city. Just a wee reminder that you can look at the historical forms of the place names by searching our corpus at placenamesni.org. You'll see those examples for Derry among many, many more if you do a search for Derry. But be warned, if you type Derry into the corpus, you'll get a lot more names than this one. As I said, Derry or Dura is a very common component in place names referring to an oakwood. So we've talked a bit about the Anglicisation and how Irish language place names have become obscured. And it's important to note that we actually have evidence of other languages in our place names. So Old Norse would have been the language spoken by the Vikings. And the Vikings, whereas they didn't extensively settle here, they left their language on some of the place names in coastal regions. So these are probably the most well-known ones. We have Strangford, which is a Norse name. Carlingford, another one. Both of these contain this element fjord, so a sea inlet. And we also have Ulfricsfjord, one that didn't stick around like the other two. Ulfricsfjord was actually a previous name for Larne Loch. So that we know that the Vikings were there and they had that name for it, but it didn't stick like the other two did. But we do have evidence for it in the historical forms. So Norse appears in some of our place names, although not really beyond the coastal areas. So yeah, if you hadn't guessed it already, Ulfricsfjord is Larne. What other languages do we have in our place names? Well, we also have Scots in our place names. Scots was spoken in lowland Scotland originally, but it spread to Ulster in Ireland during the time of the plantations. So it came alongside English in the 17th century. It's a Germanic language closely related to English in the 7th century. And Scots place names are found throughout Ulster, but mostly in counties Antrim and Donegal, where Scots people settled most heavily. So a couple of examples of elements that are of Scots origin are the word burn, which is the word for a river, and the word brae, which is a word for a hill, or a brae, a hill brae. So some other Scots elements that we see in Ulster are kirk, the Scots word for a church, which actually has its origins in Norse previous to that. Calheim is the word for a poor or a marshy farm, and there are some other examples there on the slide. So we do have elements from Scots that have made their way into our place names. So we have the situation where we have Irish language forms becoming anglicised, and then we also have influence from other names. And what sometimes happens in place names is that you get a bit of a mix, a language mix in place names, and place names sometimes pick up different elements over time. Burn Tullet River is my favourite example of this because it gives us evidence from 3 different language families. So we have the element burn, which I've already talked about being the Scots word for a river. The tullet component of burn tullet actually comes from the Irish word tullage, which is a flooding one or an abundant one, which is also a reference to the river. And then of course we have river, which is obviously the English word for river. So in a way, the word burn tullet river has 3 different references to the river. So if I had a singing voice, this is where I would sing Lionel Richie, but essentially it's 3 times a river. Burn Tullet River essentially means river, 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 but it has influences from Scots, from English, and from Irish. So we do get really interesting mixes and combinations of languages and language elements in place names. And if we have more time, I could talk in that a lot more about with some interesting examples, but we'll maybe keep that for next year. If I can make it a dairy for culture night. So just wanted to mention some useful websites. I've already said the website of the project is placenamesni.org. That's where you can search the corpus. The Ulster Placenames Society, which is also based at Queen's, has a website at ulsterplacename.org. They hold talks twice a year on place names, and also campaigns for the retention of townland names as an important marker of culture and identity. So you can see what the Placenames Society are doing there. Logainmneacha is the site, or logainmneacha is the site of the Placenames database of Ireland. So in a sense, they're like our sister project in the south. The Placenames database is a huge database that covers the whole of Ireland with authoritative Irish language forms for names. And you can do the search on their website. You can also search for place name elements and look at some distribution maps. They've got a really nice website that you can explore if you've got a bit of time. Mention some more resources here. A Dictionary of Ulster Place Names by Patrick Mackay, who used to work on the project, and some other publications that are available from the Society or from Amazon. So there are lots of different books. We have the series of the place names of Northern Ireland that was published by the Northern Ireland Place Name Project before we moved all our commentary online, which you can find on placenamesni.org. And there are some other books that talk about place names. So that's me today. I think I've given you a whistle-stop tour of the different elements that appear in our place names and how they can be obscured, as well as how they can be uncovered. I'm really disappointed that we're not together in person, because I would love to have been able to take some questions, but please do get in touch with me. My email address is on the screen. I have a Twitter page. We have a Twitter page for the project, so please follow us on Twitter and visit our websites, and please do get in touch, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks.